There's a rhythm to the market that only silence can teach you. For years I had lived away from it, away from the sound of the ticker, the murmur of brokers, the fever of speculation. But one morning, as the first light of dawn spilled across the narrow streets of Wall Street, I felt it again. A quiet pulse beneath the city's noise, subtle but unmistakable. It wasn't the thrill I once chased. It wasn't greed. It was recognition. After all the collapses, the rebuilding, the sleepless nights of reflection, something inside me had changed. I no longer wanted to conquer the market. I wanted to move with it. The old me would have rushed to trade at the first sign of life. He would have seen opportunity in every flicker, every whisper of price movement. But I had learned that the market is like the sea. It doesn't respond to shouting. It answers to rhythm. And if you're still enough, patient enough, honest enough, you can feel that rhythm before anyone else does. So I waited. Days turned into weeks. I filled my notebooks with quiet observations, not of prices, but of moods, tones, energy. I wrote down how people spoke when they were afraid, how they moved when they were hopeful, how they looked when they were lying to themselves. Because the market is just people, multiplied by leverage. If you can read people, you can read the market. I began to notice small things. The papers weren't talking about fear anymore. They were talking about recovery. The tone had changed, from panic to optimism, from despair to ambition. That's how every bull run begins, not with courage, but with forgetfulness. People forget pain faster than they forget profit, and in that forgetfulness, opportunity returns. But this time, I wasn't chasing it. I was watching it. I knew what it looked like when the world was about to run too fast. The last time, I ran with it and lost everything. This time, I would walk. There's a sacredness in restraint, a purity and patience that few understand. The crowd celebrates risk, but longevity belongs to those who know when not to act. I kept studying. Every night I returned to the charts, not for confirmation, but for calibration, to see if my mind still moved in rhythm with the market's breath. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. When it didn't, I closed the book and waited until it did again. Patience had become my trading strategy. I remembered something I wrote years ago. The market is never wrong. Opinions often are. And that included mine, especially mine. When I stopped needing to be right, I began to see clearly. And what I saw in those months was a market waking up slowly, stretching after a long sleep, gathering strength for something bigger. It was in the tone of the headlines, the volume of trades, the shift in sentiment that even the untrained eye could feel. But where they saw excitement, I saw danger, because excitement always comes before excess. I was looking for something different now, not noise, not volume. I was waiting for alignment between price, psychology, and patience. And one day, quietly, it came. It wasn't dramatic, no breaking news, no grand announcement, just a steady change, prices moving with purpose, dips being bought by hands that didn't shake, confidence returning not in shouts, but in whispers. I sat at my desk, the same one where I had once watched everything fall apart, and I felt a stillness that used to scare me. Now it calmed me. This was not the beginning of greed. This was the return of order, and I knew what to do. Not because of instinct, but because of awareness. I didn't rush to call my broker. I closed my eyes, took a breath, and reminded myself, you don't chase opportunity, you prepare for it. That day I reopened my books. not to gamble, but to listen. Because that's what the market truly is, a conversation. And for the first time in years, I was fluent again. The positions I took were small, modest, almost symbolic. Each one was a dialogue, not a declaration. I wasn't trying to prove anything to the market. I was testing my peace. And when the trades began to move in my favor, I didn't feel triumph. I felt recognition, like seeing an old friend who no longer frightened me. I realized something then. You don't really master the market. You harmonize with it. The best traders aren't prophets, they're listeners, and I had finally learned to listen. That was the beginning of the final bull run. But it wasn't just a market cycle. It was a mirror, a reflection of who I had become after losing everything. I no longer needed speed. I no longer needed praise. I only needed alignment. And that, I discovered, was what wisdom really means. Not knowing everything, just knowing when it's time. As the weeks went on, the market rose higher. Others celebrated their gains with champagne and noise. I stayed home. I made tea. I wrote in silence. Patience, I wrote, isn't waiting for the market to move. It's waiting for yourself to be ready. That sentence became my compass. Every trade after that was built upon it. Every moment of hesitation was a test of whether I still trusted it. And every profit, every calm exit, every deliberate pause was proof that I finally did. The final bull run wasn't my comeback. It was my completion, a circle closing, a lesson ending, a man learning how to trade not for survival, not for fame, not even for mastery, but for peace. I had learned to enter the market the way a diver enters water. Slow, deliberate, cutting through the surface without disturbing it. Every trade I placed was smaller than my ego would have liked. That's how I knew it was right. Ego trades for recognition. Wisdom trades for rhythm. When I made my first entry, the tape began to hum again, a soft chatter I hadn't heard in years. But it didn't excite me anymore. It grounded me. It was the sound of reality returning. The tickers spun, the numbers flashed, and I watched quietly. I wasn't chasing confirmation. I was observing conversation. The market was speaking again, and this time I knew how to listen between the lines. I saw the same patterns unfolding, the same optimism I'd once drowned in, the same confidence I'd once mistaken for skill. But I also saw something else. Clarity, a precision in movement that only appears when the market is shaking off its fear. This wasn't noise. This was structure. When structure meets patience, opportunity arrives. So I began to scale in, lightly, rhythmically, the way a musician adds notes to a melody he already knows. No sudden leaps, no grand declarations, just quiet conviction. I wrote down everything, every entry, every reason, every emotion. I wanted my journal to be my mirror, not my defense. Because when you write, you can't hide from yourself. The positions moved in my favor, and for the first time in years, my account began to breathe again. But it wasn't about the profit. It was about peace under pressure. That's the real metric of mastery, how quiet your mind stays when the numbers start to rise. I remember one afternoon, sitting by the window with the sun low in the sky, watching the tape tick like a heartbeat. I sipped my coffee and realized this was the same world that had once terrified me. But now, it couldn't, because I had stopped wanting to control it. The need to control is the first sign of fear. When you release it, you begin to see truth. And the truth was simple. The market doesn't care who you are. It only mirrors what you bring. If you bring greed, it gives you chaos. If you bring discipline, it gives you rhythm. If you bring presence, it gives you clarity. That day I traded with presence. The first wave of the bull run began to roar. Prices rose like tides under a full moon, steady, powerful, inevitable. Every newspaper headline shouted, recovery, rebirth, redemption. But I didn't feel redemption. I felt detachment. I'd seen this before. I'd seen how euphoria wears the same clothes as wisdom until it doesn't. But this time, I wasn't going to mistake one for the other. I traded small. I took profits early. And I waited. When others doubled down, I stepped back. When others bragged, I went silent. The silence was my armor. Because silence can't be manipulated. There's a point in every bull run when confidence turns into noise, when people stop asking why and start saying how high. That's when I start leaving, not because the trend is over, but because clarity always fades before prices do. I watch the frenzy build like a fire. The new traders, the young ones, their faces lit by the glow of tickers and greed. They reminded me of myself, and for the first time, I didn't feel envy. I felt compassion. I knew what they would have to learn, and I knew the market would teach them the same way it taught me. Brutally, but perfectly. I wrote in my journal that night, every bull market is a classroom. Some students leave rich, all leave educated. The next morning I took a walk before the market opened. The air was crisp, the city humming softly beneath the rising sun. I passed by a newsstand. The bull returns. One headline said in thick black letters. Another paper called it the greatest rally of the decade. I smiled. Not because they were wrong, but because they thought they understood what was happening. They never do. The market doesn't rise because people are smart. It rises because people forget. And every rally is powered by amnesia. I wasn't here to forget. I was here to remember. When I reached my office, I didn't rush to the desk. I paused by the window and watched the morning light slide between the buildings. That stillness before the opening bell felt sacred, like a prayer. It reminded me that this wasn't about revenge or even redemption. It was about reverence, the respect a man must have for something that has both broken and built him. The bell rang. The sound carried through the city like thunder dressed in brass. The market opened strong, green candles, big volume, cheers across the floor. And I did nothing. I watched. I waited. Because I wasn't here to be early. I was here to be right. The tape told me everything I needed to know. Strength, hesitation, rhythm. I could almost feel the heartbeat of the crowd through the numbers. Then quietly, I saw what I'd been waiting for. Not a signal on a chart, but a shift in emotion. The panic of buyers who suddenly realized they were too late. The relief of sellers who thought they'd missed the bottom. The tension between them. That invisible tug of war. It was all there, printed on the tape in letters no one else could read. I entered, not because I wanted to trade, but because the trade had already chosen me. When the position filled, I didn't watch it tick by tick. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked at the city below. The same streets that had once witnessed my ruin. Now they watched my return. But this wasn't a comeback. It was a conversation. I wasn't shouting at the market anymore. I was listening to it breathe. It's strange how peace can make you powerful, how quiet can make you aware. how stillness can turn into motion without a sound. The position grew, steady and graceful, and I grew with it. Not in wealth, but in understanding. Every uptick whispered a lesson. Patience pays. Every downtick echoed a reminder. Detach. I didn't feel fear anymore. I didn't feel thrill either. I felt alignment. That's what wisdom is. Alignment between the outer world and the inner one. I closed the position days later. Not at the top, but at peace. The profits were handsome, but they felt weightless, as if the money itself knew it wasn't the point. I wrote one line in my journal that night. Profit is the shadow of clarity. It follows when you stop chasing it. I slept well for the first time in months. The city outside murmured like a calm tide, and for once I didn't dream of numbers. I dreamed of silence. The market was louder now. The tickers sang with fever. The brokers spoke in lightning, and the city glowed as if gold itself was being printed in the streets. Everywhere I looked, confidence had turned into religion. The young traders believed they had discovered a new truth, one that older men like me were too cautious to grasp. But the truth is never new. It only waits for people to forget it. I walked past the brokerage houses one afternoon, the doors open wide, laughter spilling into the street. Inside, men in pressed suits slapped each other's backs, talking about fortune as if it were a birthright. Every face looked the same, flushed, eager, alive with the illusion that this time the rules had changed. They never change. I remember one boy, couldn't have been older than 20, shouting into the phone with such conviction that I almost envied him, almost. Because I knew what waited behind that conviction: silence, shock, and self-blame. The market teaches every generation the same lesson. It just changes the tuition fee. As I walked away, I thought of my younger self, the boy who once believed the ticker spoke only to him. He would have been inside that room. He would have been shouting too. But that boy was gone. In his place stood a man who had learned the difference between confidence and clarity. The headlines grew bolder with each sunrise. Unstoppable market surge, new golden age of prosperity, the language of invincibility. I had written it once myself, but I had also written its obituary. At my desk, I unfolded the morning paper and traced the numbers with a quiet smile. Everything rises beautifully before it breaks. It's a law as certain as gravity. Yet I didn't short the market. Not yet. Wisdom isn't the same as cynicism. Wisdom waits. Because the market doesn't fall when it's high. It falls when people believe it never will. And belief always peaks just before reality returns. So I waited again. My journal filled with notes, fragments of thought, reflections on the pulse beneath the chaos. The crowd is no longer trading prices, I wrote. They're trading comfort. That's when danger begins, when profit becomes validation and risk becomes entertainment. Each day the market rose higher, the noise grew louder, but inside me there was stillness, a stillness I had fought years to earn. While the world shouted, I listened. While others reached, I withdrew. Not because I feared the fall, but because I could already hear it coming. The first cracks are always invisible. They appear in tone, not in numbers. The laughter becomes nervous. The headlines become desperate. The buyers start arguing with the tape. And then slowly, the market begins to tremble under its own weight. That's when the real traders start paying attention. I had seen it too many times to mistake the signs. I watched as volume spiked without direction, as strength turned erratic, as the air grew heavy with the scent of greed turning sour. It wasn't panic yet, but it was close. I leaned back in my chair and whispered to myself, "It's almost time." There's a sacred pause before every storm, a moment so quiet you can almost hear the market inhale. If you've lived long enough, you know what comes after that breath. I began closing my positions one by one. Each exit was deliberate, quiet, respectful. I didn't announce it. I didn't explain. I just left the table while there was still light on the candles. To most, my exit looked premature. To me, it felt inevitable. A few days later, the first wave hit. Not a crash, not yet, but a shudder. The kind of movement that makes confident men adjust their ties and nervous ones check their ledgers twice. The papers called it healthy volatility. I called it denial. I didn't short it. I simply watched. There's power in restraint. More than most will ever know. By the end of the week, the second wave came, sharper, faster. Now the laughter in the brokerage houses had thinned. The young traders who had boasted of their brilliance were suddenly quiet. The tickers moved like heart monitors losing rhythm. I could feel the old instincts returning. That urge to act, to bet, to prove I still had it. But I breathed through it. The market doesn't need another hero, I reminded myself. It needs another listener. So I listened, and what I heard in the silence between the ticks was fear. Subtle, hesitant, spreading like smoke through a crowded room. It wasn't loud yet, but fear never is at the start. It begins as doubt, disguised as logic. When the next trading session opened, the market tried to rally. It always does. The crowd calls it recovery. I call it reflect. The last burst of optimism before exhaustion takes hold. That's when I moved, not recklessly, methodically. I began positioning for the fall. Small, patient entries, each one placed like a brick in a wall, not to fight the market, but to protect what peace I had earned. As I placed those trades, I didn't feel triumph. I felt gratitude. Gratitude for the chance to apply what pain had taught me. By the end of the month, the market began to collapse for real. The papers went from euphoria to confusion in a matter of days. Unexpected correction, they called it, as if human nature were ever unexpected. The streets outside my window were quieter again. The same carriages that once rushed with ambition now moved with caution. The noise faded. The silence returned. I closed the last of my positions with calm precision. No thrill, no drama. Just closure. And as I sat there, staring at the ticker tape that once ruled my life, I realized something profound. This was the first time I had ever won without needing to celebrate. That's when I knew I had finally mastered not the market, but myself. I wrote one final note in my journal that night. Wisdom doesn't trade against emotion. It waits for emotion to reveal itself, and steps aside. I poured a glass of whiskey, not as a toast, but as a ritual of completion. The room was quiet except for the faint ticking of a clock. And in that ticking, I heard what every trader eventually must, the rhythm of time. Indifferent, honest, eternal. There's no such thing as conquering the market. There's only harmony and the grace to step back when the music fades. As I looked out the window that night, I saw the lights of Wall Street glowing like embers. The bull run had ended for the crowd, but not for me. My run wasn't about prices anymore. It was about peace. Because once you stop needing to be right, you finally start to see what truth looks like. The next morning, the headlines were screaming again. Livermore wins, big in-market collapse. Boy plunger strikes once more. They still didn't understand. I hadn't struck anything. I had simply listened longer than they could bear to be silent. I folded the paper, smiled faintly, and whispered, "Let them write their stories. I already lived mine." Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of the ticker. Still spinning, still breathing, still teaching. And I realized, with a kind of quiet awe, that the market never truly changes. Only the man who learns to listen does. That night, I slept easily. No anxiety, no excitement. Just the kind of stillness that feels like understanding. And in that stillness, I felt something else. Not victory, but alignment. The kind of alignment that tells you the bull run was never about the market at all. It was about becoming the man who could live without it. Years passed, and the noise of the market softened into memory. I no longer needed the sound of the ticker to feel alive. I had learned to listen to quieter things. The hum of the city at dawn, the rustle of pages turning, the steady rhythm of my own breath. There's a peace that comes only when you've run far enough to stop chasing. People still spoke my name with a kind of reverence mixed with curiosity. Jesse Livermore, the man who mastered the market. But that wasn't true. No one masters the market. You master yourself, or you don't last long enough to matter. Sometimes young traders would find me, eager eyes, notebooks full of formulas, hearts full of fire. They wanted secrets. They wanted shortcuts. They wanted to know how to win. I would smile and tell them what they didn't want to hear. The market will teach you everything, but it will charge full price. They never liked that answer, because what they really wanted was assurance, the comfort that success could be predictable. But nothing about the market or life is predictable. It's only revealing. It shows you who you are, every fear, every ego, every weakness, and then asks, do you still want to play? The ones who said yes too quickly rarely lasted. The ones who hesitated usually learned. I sometimes wondered if that was why the market existed at all. Not to make men rich, but to make them aware. Money was never the point. It was only the mirror. And most men can't stand to see their reflection without decoration. I looked back over the decades and saw my own reflection changing. The boy who read the tape, the man who lost everything, the survivor who rebuilt, and finally, the observer who learned to let go. Each of them lived inside me, and each had something to teach. The boy taught me curiosity, the man taught me ambition, the failure taught me humility, and the quiet one taught me peace. Together they formed something greater than wealth. They formed wisdom. Wisdom is not loud. It doesn't shout in headlines or boast in returns. It whispers through patience, humility, and awareness. If I had one lesson left to give, it would be this. Don't seek control. Seek clarity. Because control is an illusion, but clarity, that's freedom. Freedom from noise, freedom from fear, freedom from the endless chase of more. I still remember the feeling of that final bull run. Not the profits, but the peace that came when I realized I could walk away and not feel loss. That's when I knew I had finally traded my last position. The market didn't need me anymore. And for the first time, I didn't need it either. So I did what I had never done before. I wrote not for myself, but for others. A small collection of thoughts, reflections, reminders, not rules. Not systems, just truth distilled by pain and time. I called it the Quiet Manual. It began like this. If you wish to trade well, you must first learn how to wait well. Patience is not the absence of action. It is disciplined presence. And then, do not measure your worth by your profit. Measure it by your peace when there is none. And the market rewards emotional maturity, not intelligence, not prediction, just presence. I wrote every line by hand, slowly, deliberately, as if I were etching a truth into glass that might break if I hurried. By the time I finished, the sun had set. The room was dim, the air heavy with the smell of ink and memory. I leaned back in my chair and looked around. The same desk, the same lamp, the same silence that once terrified me. Now it felt like home. I realized then that every chart, every trade, every failure had been leading to this, to stillness, to understanding. The real trade was never between me and the market. It was between my fear and my faith. And for the first time in my life, faith had won. Outside my window, the city glowed, its lights flickering like candles on an altar built by ambition. I didn't despise it. I respected it. Because I understood what it represented, the endless rhythm of hope and fear that drives men to create, to risk, to fall, to rise again. The market was a mirror, yes, but it was also a teacher. And like every great teacher, it used failure as its language. If I had to name the final lesson it gave me, it would be this. Peace is not the reward for winning. It's the state that makes winning irrelevant. That realization changed everything. The next morning I walked through Wall Street one last time. The streets were alive again, brokers hurrying, papers fluttering, the heartbeat of commerce pulsing underfoot. I moved through it like a ghost from another time, unseen, unbothered. At one corner, a young man shouted prices to his partner, his face lit with the same fire I once carried. For a moment I saw myself in him. The hunger, the certainty, the beautiful ignorance of believing the world could be bent by will alone. I wanted to tell him everything. I wanted to save him the pain, but I didn't. Because no man learns from warnings. He learns from weight. And the market is generous with its weight. So I kept walking. The sound of the ticker echoed faintly from a nearby window. It used to sound like destiny. Now it sounded like rhythm, steady, impartial, endless. I paused, closed my eyes and whispered to the wind, "Be patient, be humble, be ready." That's all I ever needed to know. As I left the street behind, the light shifted, the last rays of afternoon glancing off the buildings like gold on water. It looked like every bull run I'd ever seen. Bright, fleeting, beautiful. But I didn't chase it. I simply watched, grateful. Because sometimes, understanding doesn't mean holding on. It means knowing when to let beauty pass untouched. Years later, when people read about my trades, they spoke of numbers. They called me daring, brilliant, reckless, prophetic. They missed the point. The greatest trade I ever made wasn't in the market. It was the moment I stopped needing the market to define me. That's the trade no one talks about. Because it can't be charted, can't be analyzed, can't be copied. It's the quietest trade there is. The trade between noise and silence. If you're listening to this, you might think it's a story about money. It isn't. It's about awakening. It's about the journey every trader must take. From illusion to clarity, from fear to faith, from chaos to calm. The market will test you. It will tempt you. It will break you. And then, if you're lucky, it will rebuild you into someone who no longer needs it to survive. That's when you'll understand what I finally did. The real bull run, the final bull run, isn't on the chart. It's inside you. When wisdom meets opportunity, the profit is peace. And peace is the only wealth that lasts.